Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Mrs. Ross Does Math. Today our class that we are covering is Algebra 1B, the chapter 8.7. This is the second lesson of 8.7, and the topic that we are focusing on is factoring perfect square trinomials. In our last video for this chapter, we talked about factoring the differences of squares. This same pattern is going to be helping us out in factoring perfect square trinomials. So once again, our topic for today is chapter 8.7. This is factoring perfect square trinomials. Now the key words here are perfect square. Once again, we're going to be using that square root function to help us find our factors. Our essential question is the same as our previous lesson. How do you factor special products? Now, when we're factoring perfect square trinomials, we have a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. The first is the pattern for finding the square of a binomial is going to give us the pattern for factoring trinomials. So we're going to write that down. The pattern for finding the square of a binomial gives us the pattern for factoring perfect square trinomials. Okay. So the pattern for finding the square of a binomial is going to give us the pattern for factoring perfect square trinomials. So in this section, we will have two different types of perfect square trinomials. The first one is called a positive perfect square trinomial. And it's how it sounds. It's going to be a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Or it'll be written in its form as a plus b squared. Now, when we see it as its set of factors, meaning those two groupings of parentheses, we're going to see a plus b times a plus b. So that's why we call this a positive, because we have a positive here and a positive here. Now, the next one we call a positive, negative, perfect square trinomial. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to have a positive and a negative in our parentheses. What that means is that in the trinomial itself, we will see both a positive and a negative symbol. A perfect square trinomial that's a positive negative is going to look like this. It's going to look like a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. Or when it's written in its singular form, it's going to say a minus b squared. Or we will see it as a minus b, a minus b. Now, the reason why it's going to say negative or have a subtraction sign in both factors is because when we go a negative b times a negative b, that's going to give us a positive b. If instead of the letter b, I had the number 2, this would be, say, a minus 2, that negative 2 times negative 2, that would give us 4. So that's why we're going to be left with the positive b squared in the end. Now, when we're solving these, we are going to have a couple steps for success. Now, the first step is going to be identifying which type of perfect square trinomial we have. So we're going to write that down. Identify the type of perfect square trinomial. Oh, forgot the S there. Meaning, are we going to have a positive positive or a negative negative to work with? Next, we're going to write our parentheses with the signs, and we're going to factor. Okay. Lastly, we're going to double check our answer using the box method or the FOIL method. Okay, so once again, our very last step is that we're going to double check our answer, and we're going to box it or we're going to FOIL it in order to check. Now, we do have two example problems that I want to run through on this page. Now, we have these here. The first one I have is n squared plus 4h. Sorry, that's supposed to be an h here. So h squared plus 4h plus 4. Okay. In this one, this is a positive perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to write my parentheses with the positives inside. Now, in a perfect square trinomial, that's our key word, we are going to square root the last factor, and we are going to square root the first factor. Meaning the square root of h squared, we'd be left with h, so I'm going to put h and h. That means I'm going to have an h in the beginning of each parentheses. And then the square root of 4, that's 2. So I'm going to get 2 2s, so I'm going to put a 2 here and a 2 here. Our final answer, we could write it, because they are identical, is going to be h plus 2 and then squared. This would end up being our final answer. Okay. On the other side, we have n squared minus 12n plus 36. Once again, we're going to identify the type of perfect square trinomial. Is it a positive positive, or is it that negative positive that's secretly a negative negative? In this case, we're going to be left with the negative negative. So here, it's going to say, in my parentheses, a negative and a negative inside both. Now, just like I did on the other side, I'm going to factor this. And again, because this is a perfect square trinomial, I can find the square roots of my first factor, which is a, my last factor, which is c, just like we did on our previous lesson. So here, I'm going to find the square root of n squared, which is n. So I'm going to have n and n inside my parentheses. And the square root of 36, that happens to be 6. So I'm going to put a 6 in both. Now, once again, because these are identical, I can create one parentheses with my squared notation, and my answer is going to be n minus 6 squared. Now, sometimes we're going to see numbers in front of our n squared, meaning we're going to have a coefficient. So I'm wanting to do a couple of examples with you that have that. And again, if at any point you need to pause this video, you need to go back, rewatch it, please do any of that. If you are still a little confused, please send me a message, leave me a comment, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can. Next, when taking a look at our examples, we have x squared plus 16x plus 64. This type of polynomial, this type of trinomial is a positive positive, so in our parentheses we are going to have 2 plus signs. Now again, we're going to find the square root of the first term, which in this case is going to leave us with x. And we're going to find the square root of the last term, which is going to leave us with 8. That means I'm going to have x plus 8 up front and x plus 8 in the back. This will be my final answer. I would also accept this here, x plus 8 squared. This is also okay. Okay. Now, like I said earlier, sometimes we're going to have to factor things that have a number in front of our variable. That number in front of our variable is called the coefficient. Here, we want to factor 9y squared minus 12y plus 4. This is a negative positive, which is secretly that negative negative, so that's what I'm going to put in my parentheses. Here, again, I'm going to square root the first term, and I'm going to square root the last term. Now, my first term here is 9. So the square root of 9, that's 3. And because I have a y attached to it, my square root of 9y squared is 3y. So I'm going to have 2 sets of 3y in these parentheses. Lastly, the square root of 4, that's 2. So I'm going to have those 2 sets of parentheses again. So we have 3y minus 2 and 3y minus 2, leaving us with the final answer of 3y minus 2 squared. Now, in this particular problem, I am going to check it just to make sure that everything looks good. And I'm going to use the box method. So I'm going to do that over here. So I'm going to write 3y and negative 2, 3y and negative 2. 3 times 3 is 9, y times y is y squared, so we get 9y squared. 3 times negative 2 is negative 6, so I'm going to get negative 6y. Negative 2 times 3, once again, that's negative 6, so we're going to include the y. And then negative 2 times negative 2, that gives me positive 4. When we combine our terms here diagonally, we get 9y squared minus 12y plus 4. That is what we had in our original problem, so therefore the 3y minus 2 squared, in parentheses squared, is going to be our final answer. Now the last problem that I have for you is this one here. This is a little bit of a reverse from what we commonly see. Typically we see the solo variable at the front, we see just a number in the back. This one has 2 different variables. In that case, it's both s and t. Now, the fact that it has 2 different variables is not going to change the way in which we solve this. It is still a perfect square trinomial, and in fact, it's a positive perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to have those 2 sets of parentheses here, and they're both going to include a plus sign. Now, I'm going to go through the same thing as I did before, and I'm going to square root the first term, and I'm going to square root the last term. The square root of 4 is 2, and I have an s attached to this as well as s squared. So I'm going to be left with 2s and 2s. So I'm going to put that here in my parentheses. Sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. And over here, I'm going to have t squared. That's going to leave me with t and t. So I'm going to include that here. Now, I have 2s plus t and 2s plus t. Our final answer in this is going to be 2s plus t squared. And I'm going to really emphasize that t here since we have the plus sign as well. Now, once again, we need to make sure that our answer is correct. So we are going to go ahead and once again use the box method. To solve this, I have 2s and I have t. I have 2s and I have t. 2 times 2 is 4. S times s is going to give us s squared. So we're going to get 4 s squared. I have 2 times 2s times t, so that's going to give me 2st. Anytime we have more than one variable, we want to write them in alphabetical order. So since s comes before t, that's why I have the s there. Next, I've got t times 2s, so once again, I'm going to be left with 2st. And then I have t times t, that's going to give me t squared. Now, when I add my terms together, I am going to be left with, once again, the 4s squared plus 4st plus t squared. Because this answer matches the one that we have up here, our answers are correct. Now, once again, if you guys have any questions at all, please leave me a comment, send me a message, and I will do everything I can to get back to you in a timely manner. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Mrs. Ross Does Math.